Will no one rid me of these turbulent sci-fi games? Today on Attention Span Labs. Hello and welcome to Attention Span Labs. I'm your host, Michael DiBaggio, and today we're going to be talking about if any of these war games or any other war games could displace these two games. Not these two games in particular. This is 40K 3rd edition, and this is Star Wars Miniature Battles, both of which are out of print. But what I'm wondering about is if there is any particular game, or not necessarily a game, but let's say I hate to use the word, but an intellectual property that could dethrone, from the public mind at least, the center bearing of the pivot point of, say, the Warhammer games or various Star Wars games, whether they be X-Wing, Legion, or whatever, from the forefront of miniature wargaming. Now, specifically what I'm talking about here is in terms of actual wargaming. And note that in no way here am I saying that I believe, because I do not, that more people play 40K or Age of Sigmar or Star Wars Legion or X-Wing or Armada than play all other types of miniature war games. I do not believe that. I believe the evidence we have to that is to the contrary, and I think once you stop playing outside of a sort of the very limited environment of your friendly local game store, you'll see that a huge amount of wargaming is actually done in other game systems, both particularly historicals. And I think just as a whole, taken as a whole, there's more historical gamers. So I really do believe that. Now, when I say gamers, I mean people who play the game. I'm not talking about people who watch lore videos on YouTube. I'm not talking about people who play Warhammer or Star Wars video games. Obviously, when you talk about people who know about them, there's a ton more of those sorts of people. But again, that only applies if you don't also count historical video games. Because if you count the World War II video games on top of World War II table gaming, then again you're going to have Star Wars and Warhammer recede into the background. But I'm talking about people who play the games. I'm not talking about people who buy the miniatures and never open them. I'm not talking about people who buy rules and don't read them. I'm not talking about people who buy them to paint them and don't play them, like an awful lot of YouTubers do. That's part of the hobby, but it's not the hobby. It's a subset of the hobby. And it's not the wargaming hobby. When you compare people who do historical war games, they're all playing them. So that's what I'm talking about. Is there a game? Is there something that could depose these actual games? And it's not going to be a historical game, obviously, because there's too many historical Game Wars rule sets. The closest you come to is bolt action, which maybe does actually come close to dethroning them. Awful lot of people play bolt action or Flames of War, but I think there has to be, in order to meet this criteria, there has to be an actual, an own thing, a property that could dethrone, because we're talking about one game now. We're not talking about a genre, right? These are obviously the sci-fi genre, but it doesn't have to be of the sci-fi genre. It could be fantasy, it could be, horror, it could be post-apocalypse or something like that. So what game is it? And there is an answer, and it's not any of these books in front of you. Unfortunately, I'll spoil it a bit. Before I get into that, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Why am I wearing rubber gloves? Well, it's because my hands are horribly messed up, and I wouldn't want you to see them and become all disgusted. I was visited by the gift of hand, foot, and mouth disease earlier this week. My daughter got it, and she spread it around the house. And fortunately, I got it worse than anybody else. And I say fortunately because I wouldn't want my kids to suffer in the same way. I had basically awful sores all over my hand, and I still do all over my hands and feet now. They're much better now. So thank you for your prayers, those of you who knew about it, who I mentioned it to, because it's certainly not. It's by no means a life-threatening disease. It is super debilitating in infection, right? It's way worse than your normal cold where you kind of feel bad for a while, but this was sanity breaking, actually. The itch, it started out as like this real crazy tickle burn itch, and then it progressed into this excruciating burning, and I had to have my hands and feet like soaking in oatmeal water for almost the whole day. And it was the sort of thing that it itched so much that at night you couldn't sleep. So yes, threatening of sanity, but I through the grace of God and through the help of oatmeal water, I was able to come through. So that aside, let's think about what is it that makes the Warhammer and Star Wars games, whatever versions they happen to be, what makes them the dominant game? Well, one thing is that the Star Wars obviously has a huge, and more so Warhammer than Star Wars. I'll admit that, but everybody knows Star Wars, so that sheer notability and popularity of it is going to attract people to a particular game universe. Same thing with Warhammer now. Warhammer is now very well known, especially 40,000, and even for many years it was sort of the forefront of. It was the most standout example out of many sci-fi miniature war games. So it's really a tall order for any sort of game system, especially a generic one to dethrone them. So I'm not just talking about rules, but I'm talking about the whole thing, the miniatures, the setting, everything. But I think we can immediately start right away by saying the strength of these two are in their setting. And there's not too many, so we could probably eliminate right away games with a sort of generic setting or that are meant to be miniatures agnostic. Not that, again, these are bad games. All of these games here are good. All of them. They are. At least the ones I played. I enjoyed them quite a bit. And there's nothing wrong with being miniatures agnostic. I prefer that, actually, but and I'm all for mixing miniatures as long as they're of the same appropriate scale. So, but I think we have to admit that for a game to dethrone them, it would have to be one that has something inherent about its setting, about its miniatures, and everything that's going to attract people. So generic ones are not going to cut it. So that's going to remove games like, frankly, Xenos Rampant, the Rampant games, Dragon Rampant, Lion Rampant. It's going to remove games like a Stargrave, Frostgrave, Silver Bayonet. Those are all very, very popular games, but if they don't have a setting, something that's going to attract people to really draw people to them and replace in people's minds these titans. We can also probably eliminate most historical war games for two reasons. One, as I said, you're never going to have, you can't own history, right? Thank goodness. There's always going to be dozens of World War II war games, dozens of medieval, 100 Years' War, 30 Years' War, Civil War, American Civil War, pike and shot, ancients, all these different you're going to have lots of them always. So the fragmentary nature of it means you're always going to split your audience. The other part of it is that to normies, they're probably more attracted to fantasy than history, because unfortunately in today, not that normies are into fantasy, you understand, but the kind of more normie adjacent people that would play in miniature war games is going to be more into that, like a fantastic thing, because they don't know history, unfortunately. So that brings a couple obvious things that are not here, but that would probably contend. The most obvious one, I think, is Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is pure fantasy, not sci-fi, but we'll consider both of these fantasy in the sense of not being historical. right? So, I mean, fantasy in the broadest possible sense. They could be horror, they could be superhero, they could be space sci-fi, they could be pulp, whatever. So the Lord of the Rings games, and Lord of the Rings games, indeed, when they came out as a mass war game, they've only been out a couple times as a mass war game. Unfortunately, both times by Games Workshop, but they're very popular, extremely popular. Yet they did not dethrone these games. So why is that? One obvious reason, I think, is that Games Workshop did not want a licensed game to dethrone their main game, especially when they're eventually going to lose their license. Okay, so they're not going to push it as much. But for whatever reason, it didn't do it. So I think we can exclude the Lord of the Rings games. But certainly a very close contender. But keep that, if someone comes out with a very good Lord of the Rings game, that's super well, Wargame, I mean, that's very well supported. It has a nice batch of affordable miniatures, that maybe. Another obvious one is Battletech. Battletech, again, very popular for a long time, increasing in popularity now. There was a big exodus to Battletech from Warhammer, and more recently, and of course, it had its own problems, but Battletech obviously also did not do it. So we got to exclude Battletech as well. And I think the problem with Battletech is different. It's not even that it's less well known or anything. It's actually, it holds up very well. The lore is very good. It's very interesting. It looks cool, but it's not at a scale. It's at mech scale. These mechs are 30, 50 feet, 80 feet tall. Infantry are very tiny, which is the sort of same problem with this game, Heavy Gear Blitz. Again, a very, very good game, very cool mech game from DreamPod 9. These mechs are smaller. They're about 10 to 15 feet tall in general. But still, the scale you're fighting in is basically 1/144th. The Battletech miniature scale is like 1/200, 300, something like that. It's small. It's smaller than way smaller than. This is basically HO scale. This is basically 12, 15 millimeter scale. So it's even smaller than HO scale if you're familiar with trains only. So it doesn't have the same appeal as infantry combat in 28 millimeter, which is basically the dominant scale that we have today. For whatever reason, that's how it came to be, the 25 to 28 millimeter. That's what everybody plays in. So that also eliminates games like All Quiet and the Martian Front, which of course is based on War of the Worlds. It's just too much an epic scale game. 6 millimeter and 10 millimeter are super popular with historical wargaming, but less popular with sort of normie wargamers. They're too small, even though it's a better spectacle. It's like it seems, for whatever reason, it's too weird for them. So I think Battletech and Heavy Gear are out of the picture. And you think what's left? There's nothing left in terms of actual war games. I would agree. There's nothing left, being that it can't be historical and all that other consideration. But there is an obvious one. I think it's very obvious, and it is a game. And if it was made into a miniature war game, I think it would be absolutely dominant. And we're going to see what that is in just a second. 3, 2, 1, poof. That's right, it's Rifts. Rifts, if you are unfamiliar, is a tabletop role-playing game. It's a game that already exists. It existed for over 30 years now. I believe it came out in 1990 or so, maybe 1991. That means it's actually pretty close to contemporary with the original 40K. It predates 40K second edition. It's been continuously in print from Palladium Games. And if you can't tell right away why I think it would be an obvious contender as an independent entity to knock out Warhammer or Star Wars domination of miniature war games. Well, are you blind? So a couple things jump out. Is that there's a huge amount of lore for it. So anybody who gets into the game by watching, fluff videos on YouTube, or they're going to read novels or something, Rifts has that kind of background for it. The idea of it is that in approximately the year 2100, there was a big nuclear war, and the explosions that killed many billions of people unleashed their psychic death cry, and that ruptured the ley lines, and that brought all kinds of magical transformations, open dimensional rifts, altered the land, created huge tidal waves, and earthquakes and volcanoes, and Atlantis reappeared, and mountains grew, and land sunk, and humanity was almost but not completely wiped out in this, and only caches of their like ridiculously advanced technology survived, based on like nanotech and nuclear fusion and rail guns and lasers and stuff like that. But around the core of those centers grew up the remnant of human resistance, while the rest of the world was taken over by dinosaurs, by disgusting tentacled alien intelligences, by vampires with laser guns, by robots and mutant kangaroos, all this stuff. So that it has a very deep lore, which not all of it's great. I'll admit that, but not all of how do I put it nicely? Not all of Warhammer lore is written by Shakespeare, and not all of Star Wars lore, especially even in the days of Timothy Zahn writing the novels. Not all those novels were great, and let alone now. We all know most of it's crap now. This is super gonzo fun. The other thing that instantly should jump out to you is the types of miniatures that you could have. Take a look at those. Giant robots, powered armor, robot sharks, dinosaurs, people with bionic limbs, cyborgs, alien giant gargoyles, giant kangaroos, as I mentioned before, cowboys on robot horses, sexy women, vampires, giant mechs, knights fighting giants. The list goes on. They're unlike a lot of other games that aren't necessarily set up for. If I can get that to stand again. Yeah, unlike a lot of other games that aren't necessarily set up for a wargaming environment, Rifts is actually, in my opinion, far better suited as a wargaming environment than as a role-playing game environment. There's most of the Rifts books are presented in a way that deals with very high-level politics and sort of the clash of civilizations, and it's less obvious how a small group of adventurers fits into a lot of those scenarios, even though there's a lot of very good adventure scenarios in there. So I don't want to turn you off from Rifts as a role-playing game. It has its problems, mainly sort of with the intelligibility of the rules and the power creep as the books go on. But as a setting, it's top notch. But it's better suited as a wargaming thing. In fact, so much of these, especially these like the Coalition War Campaign, Coalition Navy, Atlantis, Triax, and the NGR. That's the New German Republic, by the way. That's what NGR stands for. They're heavily oriented towards apocalyptic clashes of countries against other countries, with ridiculous varieties of tanks, of powered armor, of giant robots, of dragons and demons and superheroes and cyberpunk type things, where you have bionically and drug stimulated assassins and superhumans and cruise missiles and shapeshifters and werewolves and aliens from other dimensions waging incredibly destructive wars on one another in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. And if that is not an ideal setting that appeals to the kind of people that are drawn into games like Warhammer, I don't know what is. The other thing I think that I just gave away is that this is cross-genre. In Rifts, there's it's science fiction, as you can see, very obviously. It's horror, with the vampires and the demons and the Cthulhu type entities and these, nasty alien slavers going around kidnapping people and they're in Africa. There's huge armies of undead, and the biblical four horsemen of the apocalypse are roaming around trying to unleash hell on earth, right? Or quasi-biblical, I should say. So there's that's the horror element. There's this very strong fantasy element. In Rifts, England, there's literal old school knights of like the Round Table, and Merlin is there, this magic, and they fight giants. But the knights also have laser guns, and they're Arthur is a psychic that is attuned to a sword left over from before the nuclear war 300 years before, that called Caliber X, that is tunes into human psychic abilities and greatly enhances them. So that brings us to the the cyberpunk aspect of it. You have all these boosted mercenaries and assassins. You got guys that are stimulated by drugs called juicers, and they get superhuman strength and reflexes and everything, but they die. It burns out their bodies. You get crazies who have basically these, what they call the mom implants, the mind over matter brain implants, to basically unlock their quasi-psychic potential, but they, the side effect, it often turns them insane. So it's you get people with bionic arms and full conversion cyborgs. It's not a robot. I mean, there aren't robots in this game. There's robots out the ass in this game, but that's a guy who has full body turned over to metal, right? You got Western, right? The western part of the U.S. is filled with guys riding like robot horses and rounding up dinosaurs, things like that, and fighting aliens. You have, the whole setting is post-apocalyptic, obviously, but like in Australia, it's a very obviously it's a Mad Max Road Warrior kind of setting, where there's only a few cities and like huge strips of desolate desert wasteland between them, and there's guys riding like Gaslands type souped up cars and stuff, fighting each other, and they ride giant kangaroos, these bandit scavenger bands. So yeah, Rifts is every genre that you can think of, aside from like romance, I guess, thrown into one. And if that sounds like crap to you, then I understand why, but it's one of those things that like it shouldn't work. Do you ever see a movie that's like so crazy over the top, and you're like, man, this is going to be dumb, and then you're like, oh wow, this is actually somehow really good. Like, I don't know, like Excalibur was like that, or The Spirit. I thought, and you go in there thinking like it's so overacted, it's so crazy, like the stuff going on is too over the top, and yet it somehow comes out as somehow believable. That's what Rifts is, and that's why I think it would definitely pose a threat to the Warhammer Star Wars domination of the sci-fi. And of course, it's one game. So one guy owns it. One company owns it, Palladium Games. And if it was well supported, and I think they could do it by coming out. They would focus first on the coalition states and some of the middle North America, the smaller states there, in which a lot of the armies, especially, are these small, from a couple dozen to a few hundred men mercenary companies, and they have tanks and some giant robots and power armor and vampire killers and stuff like that, because like Mexico is completely overrun by vampires and so forth. That's a good start. Then you start getting on to the but certainly you got to start with the coalition states, which are sort of the remnant of the American Empire, as they call it, because they have, it's really and there's naval stuff, there's air stuff, there's not much space stuff, because for a particular reason there's an explanation for it in the game. But there, and then you could do things like you go over to these dimension books where because there's portals to other dimensions that cross over here, and there's like superhero worlds, and there's people with superhero powers in the setting. They don't sort of act in this usually on Rift's Earth. They don't act as like costume superheroes usually, but sometimes they do. But there's like alien civilizations that are very much like Space Marvel, Space DC kind of stuff that you could bring over. You could have superhero teams as strike forces. You can have the giant mech armies of Germany fighting against the brute mechanized gargoyles of the Gargoyle Empire. You're going to have Atlantis as an army, obviously, but you can have a lot of these smaller bands. You're going to have, the vampire kingdoms are in Mexico. They're not necessarily technological, but they are very sophisticated and well organized. Farther south, South America is filled with human empires and non-human empires. Stuff from fantasy games coming over, and so you have, you're going to have everything from knights on horseback to guys with jetpacks, to giant robots, to mutant animal riders, the Simvan and Broadkill and stuff like that, and they're these demons from other dimensions that eat people and that they don't really use technology, but they're super big and strong and hard to kill, and the other people like scavengers riding dinosaurs and stuff like that. So there are, in terms of factions, even major factions, there's at least a dozen. So it's instantly comparable to Warhammer 40K in that regard. So maybe another video I could get into suggestions for some factions. But the part I unfortunately want to end this video on is that this is never going to happen. Unfortunately, I do think this is the one game, the one existing property that has enough of everything in a crazy system, that in a crazy universe, that would make awesome miniatures based off amazing artwork. As you can see in the covers, inside artwork's usually not as good, but still, there's just this is so good. The artwork is so awesome here on these old books. These are from the 90s for the most part, but they didn't intend to make some of these giant robots or whatever, but on these two books, I think the artist was they turned in these awesome designs and hey, we have to make them into a thing in the game. And so that's exactly what you need to make a successful miniature war game, which is all about visual spectacle. And the designs are great. The designs are all over the place, but they're great. And they offer a bit of it to everyone. But it's never going to happen. And why? Well, because the owner of the company, Kevin Simbita, he tried to launch a miniature war game based on Robotech, and his company really was successful in the beginning because it had the rights to, long before Rifts. They had a fantasy game and everything, which is very good. But the company Palladium got successful because of two licenses they had. One was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, super successful. They don't have it anymore, I don't think. The other one they still have is Robotech. Robotech's not as big now, but it was huge at the time in the 80s and everything. And a few years ago, he tried to launch a Robotech a Kickstarter. He did launch a Kickstarter for a Robotech miniature war game. Very well received, well backed. It succeeded in terms of fundraising, and it failed in terms of delivery. I don't know the whole story, but it was a debacle. And I know that he's basically, I don't know whose fault it is, right? I'm very hard on people who don't fulfill Kickstarters. So in that sense, I think, he's I won't restrict my criticism of him for that, because he let a lot of people down and stole tens of thousands of dollars, right? Because it doesn't matter if you used it but failed, right? Because people expected to get it. You were promising people get it. He's been running the company for enough years that I would say that amounts to fiduciary negligence, if not necessarily fraud. I'm sure he did not intend to fraud people, but he effed up so badly that he couldn't deliver the game. And it's not quite true that he didn't deliver it, because I saw copies that were available for sale because some stores got it and backers didn't, and they could only produce so much of it. So that failed so hard. So with that, nobody, like, he doesn't have the backing to do this again. No one would give him the money to do it, and I mean, I wouldn't either, frankly. You know, I know, I'm not saying he's a shit human being, because I don't believe that. I know a lot of people, I do not think he was out to thieve. He was not intentionally out to swindle people, but he was not responsible with the money. You know, he was not realistic with it. He asked people for, and he probably couldn't deliver with what he got, but even though it raised a lot of money. So that's why it's never going to happen, which is a shame, because it could totally kick the shit out of, sorry, I shouldn't be swearing like that, but it could dominate. It is the one independent setting I can think of that could really dominate the sci-fi fantasy wargaming, the wargaming world, that could dethrone 40K, Age of Sigmar, and Star Wars. So what do you think? Do you agree with me? Is there another game that you or setting that you think would do just as well or better? Let me know. Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. This is Attention Span Lab signing off.